welcome back to another MNS tutoring video, and in this video we're going to be starting our first unit in grade 9 science ecology. So in this video I'm going to be talking to you guys about food chains and different types of ecosystems where different types of food chains can sustain themselves. So let's begin with the idea of a thought. What is a food chain? Well, a food chain is basically a virtual chain that animals rely on to stay sustained, with a reliable source of food and a cycle that continues as long as the ecosystem is able to thrive. So let's go on right now to continue to talk about the different parts of the food chain and how each part plays a really specific role in maintaining the ecosystem's healthiness and the ecosystems really need to survive. So first off, we're going to start off with producers. The producers are the base of the food chain. They make their own food with photosynthesis, which most of you already know, and they're also the food for all other animals. Something that you guys may have not known is producers also provide shelter for smaller animals. So they not only provide energy for the animals above it in the food chain, but it also provides shelter for other smaller animals, such as grasshoppers in this case, which is really unique because producers are one of the only parts of the food chain that actually do that. They're the only ones that provide shelter for other animals rather than just providing food or energy up the food chain. So now let's move on to the second part of the food chain, which are the primary consumers. Well, the primary consumers are basically smaller consumers. They're usually insects, small rodents, um, and usually other animals that rely on the producers for food. They eat plants, and mostly all primary consumers are herbivores. In this case, you'll notice that the primary consumer is the grasshopper. And as I mentioned before, the grasshopper will usually rely on the producers for food and shelter. So the producer is giving the grasshopper a two-way niche in the food chain. The niche is a role an organism plays in the ecosystem. So in this case, the grass is giving the grasshopper shelter. So I'll put an S over here, and it's giving it food, right? Apart from that, all the arrows in the food chain go to where the energy goes. So all the grass that's been eaten by the grasshopper gives the grasshopper energy. Due to different glucose, carbons, and every other nutrients in the grass that actually give the grasshopper a sustainability to survive. So now, what do the arrows actually mean in the food chain? Well, there's actually different types of arrows in the food chain. In this food chain, you can see that there are only bold red arrows, but usually when there are dotted arrows, something like this, maybe, right? It usually means that there's a weak connection between the organism in the food chain, right? This usually happens when an organism doesn't mainly rely on such and such thing for food, and it also gets its food for something else, which can really cause a weak connection in the food chain. But a weak connection in the food chain is perfectly fine, because if a grasshopper, say for example, gets its nutrients, gets its energy from not only grass, but let's say it also gets it from let's say tree bark or something other than grass, right? It's a good relation in the food chain because it provides the tree bark or anything else in the food chain with a role to play in the ecosystem. So now let's move on to the secondary consumer, and in this case, the secondary consumer is the bluebird. So the secondary consumers are usually consumers that eat other smaller primary consumers. And usually in this case, the bluebird is an omnivore, as it eats some plants as well. It'll eat some plants and berries as well. Um, in a very rare case scenario, the secondary consumer can be carnivorous, but in this case, the bluebird is not. So beside the bluebird, I'll just write it can be either an omnivore, or it can be a carnivore, right? Now let's move on to the tertiary consumer. The tertiary consumer is usually the consumer that's on the top of the food chain. And this usually means that the tertiary consumer relies on everything below it in the food chain, which in this case is grass, the producer, the grasshopper, um, the grasshopper, and the bluebird for food. And the snake does not really have any specific eating habits, and in this case, it shows us something really about a lot of the tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers, since they're so high up on the food chain, um, they can really eat anything that they want. So usually, usually the snakes will eat anything that they can get their hands onto, and being the tertiary consumer, um, the snake has a really big job to play as he really manages everything below him in the food chain. Um, and the tertiary consumer usually always eats primary or secondary consumers, and sometimes even producers. Say for example, let's say a grizzly bear, is sometimes considered a tertiary consumer depending on the ecosystem, and it is an omnivore as it sometimes eats a lot of producers as well, like something like fruits, berries, some grass shrubs, and so on. So now let's move on to the last actual living organism in the food chain, which is the owl. The owl is the apex predator, as it has nothing it can really it can there's nothing it can be eaten by, and it's on top of everything in the food chain. Well, some of you may be thinking, well, I thought you just said that the tertiary consumer was on top of the food chain. Well, it's really not, because the tertiary consumer just gives its energy to the owl. The tertiary consumer has a really big role as to controlling the food chain, but something even bigger than that. An apex predator is not present in all food chains, but in a food chain where there is a lot of different variety of species and organisms, an apex predator is sometimes needed to control all the organisms within it. So in this case, the apex predator is the owl, and as you may notice, the owl may eat anything from snakes to other smaller rodents that can be considered primary consumers. So again, the owl is on top of the food chain, and after the owl dies, or it naturally, expires, the owl then gives its energy to the decomposers. The decomposers are a very special organism in the food chain, because they not only rely on the food of dead and decayed animals, but they really bring the energy to a cycle in the food chain. And without the decomposers, all the energy would just die off as the apex predator. So without the decomposers, this arrow would never be there, because there's nothing to transfer the energy from the owl to back to the producers. So the decomposers play a really big role in the ecosystem, as they keep the energy moving back to the producers, so as to where it came from, using photosynthesis, of course. So what decomposers actually do is they decompose, as the name suggests. And as the owl dies, they decompose a lot of the owl's nutrients back into the soil. And what this does, it provides the grass with a lot of nutrients. So basically, all the nutrients from this owl then go to the grass, right? It provides it with many nutrients, right? And that's why decomposers are one of the most important parts of the food chain. There's in this food chain, there's not really any scavengers, but scavengers are any organisms or species in the food chain that rely on other dead animals for food, but they don't really help the producers. They rely on the food for themselves. So the scavengers would really be something outside the food chain, and they would just rely on basically any dead food that they could get their hands on, right? Not really looking at what it is, or and really in a role they would play in the ecosystem, right? They just manage all the decayed dead waste, preventing a lot of the diseases in the ecosystem itself. So now let's move on to invasive species. Well, what are invasive species? Well, invasive species are species that are not native to an ecosystem. And what happens when there's an invasive species in an ecosystem is the entire food chain collapses. Well, how is this the case? Well, recently, I know in Ontario, the Asian longhorn beetle was shipped accidentally, of course, from China to Canada, and it's been destroying many of the ecosystems, the years to be thriving ecosystems that have been going on for years and years in Canada. And what invasive species do is they don't really belong in the food chain, but they take a lot of the resources. So say for example, I have the Asian longhorn beetle over here, and it's in the middle of the food chain, right? The Asian longhorn beetle, since it does not really belong in the food chain, there's nothing that can get its energy. There's nothing that is adapted to actually kill it as prey and then eat it. So what the Asian longhorn beetle does is, in this case, it usually feeds on mostly grasshoppers and grass as well. So it usually takes the energy from the grasshoppers and the grass, right? And since there's nothing to really control the Asian longhorn beetle's population, it just keeps on overpopulating until there's way too many of the Asian longhorn beetle. So continuous overpopulation of the Asian longhorn beetle. And then after this happens, such a large population of Asian longhorn beetles needs so many more resources to be able to sustain the population. So slowly you'll begin to notice in the ecosystem that there is no more grass because the Asian longhorn beetle usually take all of it as a means of sustaining the population. As there's no more grass, there becomes no more grasshoppers because grasshoppers now no longer have a means of getting energy. And since there's no grasshoppers, there's really no secondary consumers. There's no bluebirds. Since there's no bluebirds, there's no snakes because now snakes don't have a means of getting any energy or nutrients. And now since snakes are really extinct and they are no longer in the ecosystem anymore, owls, the apex predator, everything that's controlling the food chain now no longer has anything to get its energy from. And sooner or later, the owl is usually dead or it goes extinct in the specific ecosystem. And now that the owl is gone, the decomposers have nothing to decay into back to the soil as there's no other organisms left except, of course, the Asian longhorn beetles. And eventually, as the whole ecosystem falls apart, the Asian longhorn beetle as well also expires. It also dies off, and the population of the ecosystem soon eventually becomes zero. So as soon as there's an invasive species introduced in an ecosystem, we as humans need to do something to control the population or completely destroy the population of the invasive species so it does not destroy an entire food chain, so it does not destroy an entire ecosystem. So again, invasive species are very harmful to food chains and ecosystems on the whole and cause devastating impacts to the entire ecosystem. So that was the video, guys, on food chains. I hope you guys learned something new. If you have any comments or concerns, please feel free to leave it down in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Other than that, thanks for watching, guys.